wind in the eastern desert does not move the way people imagine. It does not roar or sweep in dramatic gusts. Instead, it works patiently, grain by grain, lifting the surface of the dunes a fraction at a time and setting it down somewhere else, so that the landscape you photograph in the morning is subtly different by dusk. For the archaeologists who spend their careers in these places, this slowness is both an enemy and an ally. It buries things beyond reach, and then, decades or centuries later, it uncovers them again with the same indifference. Much of what we know about the ancient world did not survive because someone protected it. It survived because sand happened to fall on it at the right moment and happened to move away at another. This is the uncomfortable truth at the center of desert archaeology, and it is worth sitting with before we go any further. We tend to speak about buried history as though it were hidden deliberately, as though the past concealed itself and waited for us to be clever enough to find it. The reality is far more accidental. Wind, flooding, the collapse of a riverbed, the shifting of a coastline, the slow abandonment of a town when its wells ran dry. These are the forces that decide what endures. The people who lived in these settlements were not thinking about legacy. They were thinking about water, about grain, about taxes owed to a distant authority, about the health of their children. When we uncover their homes, we are not recovering their intentions. We are recovering the byproducts of ordinary life, frozen at the moment the environment turned against them. Consider what actually happens when a settlement is lost to sand. It is rarely sudden. There is no single storm that swallows a town in an afternoon, whatever the popular imagination suggests. More often, it is a gradual retreat. A trade route shifts because a new road becomes safer or a harbor silts up. Families leave one by one, taking what they can carry and abandoning what they cannot. The heavier objects stay behind, grinding stones, storage jars sunk into the floor, the mud brick walls themselves. For a while, the empty houses stand, and then the roofs fall in, and the wind begins its work. Within a generation, the streets are ankle-deep in sand. Within a century, the whole place is a low mound, indistinguishable from the natural rise and fall of the terrain. Unless you know precisely what you're looking at, and knowing what to look at is the real skill, one that has almost nothing to do with the romantic image of discovery. The modern archaeologist standing on such a mound is reading signals most people would never notice. A scatter of pottery fragments too dense to be natural. A change in the color of the soil where ancient organic material once decayed. Straight lines in the landscape because nature almost never produces perfectly straight lines. But human beings produce them constantly, in walls and irrigation channels, and property boundaries. Increasingly, this reading is done from above, using satellite imagery and aerial survey, where the faint outlines of buried structures reveal themselves as subtle differences in how vegetation grows or how moisture is retained. A wall a meter below the surface changes the soil above it, just enough that a crop planted there will grow a shade differently. From the ground, you would see nothing. From 400 kilometers up, a pattern emerges. This is the first assumption worth challenging. The phrase we associate with these finds, the idea of an untold chapter suddenly emerging, implies a moment of revelation, a single instant when the past reveals itself. But an excavation is not a moment. It is years of work, most of it slow and physically punishing, and frankly, tedious. The image of a scholar brushing sand away to reveal a golden face belongs to cinema. The real work involves grid squares marked out with string, meticulous recording of the exact position of every fragment, buckets of spoil sifted through mesh screens under an unforgiving sun. A single season might advance a dig by only a few centimeters of depth across a small area. The revelation, when it comes, is assembled from thousands of individually unremarkable observations. What looks like a dramatic discovery in a headline is almost always the visible tip of an enormous, patient, largely invisible effort. But let us be fair to the sense of wonder these finds inspire, because it is not entirely misplaced. There is something genuinely startling about the completeness of what the desert can preserve. In wetter climates, organic material rots. Wood, textile, paper, leather, food, human remains. All of it breaks down quickly when there is moisture and oxygen and the bacteria that thrive on them. The desert is hostile to that kind of decay. Its dryness is a kind of accidental embalming. This is why some of the most extraordinary survivals from the ancient world come from arid regions. Not because those civilizations were more remarkable, but because their trash and their treasures alike were spared the slow erasure that consumed everyone else's. The documents are perhaps the most powerful example of this. In the dry sands of certain regions, archaeologists have recovered enormous quantities of written material that would have been lost anywhere else. Not monumental inscriptions carved to impress, but the disposable paperwork of ordinary existence. Tax receipts, private letters, shopping lists, complaints to officials, school exercises where a child practiced the same lines over and over, legal contracts over the sale of a donkey, a soldier writing home to ask his mother to send socks and to say he had received the money she sent. These fragments, discarded as worthless in their own time, are among the most valuable things we possess because they let us hear voices that history was never supposed to record. Kings and generals leave monuments. The ordinary person leaves almost nothing unless the sand intervenes. This changes the meaning of the phrase untold chapter in a way worth pausing on. When we imagine the untold parts of history, we usually think of lost cities, forgotten kingdoms, dramatic secrets. But the genuinely untold chapters are more often the quiet ones. The daily texture of lives that no chronicle recorded because those lives were considered too insignificant to write down. The woman who ran a small business and kept careful accounts. The tenant farmer arguing about the price of his harvest. The scale of ordinary human experience that the official record simply does not contain. When a buried settlement gives up its contents, the most important thing it offers is not gold or grandeur. It is ordinariness, preserved at a resolution we can almost never achieve otherwise. Of course, this raises difficult questions, and any honest account has to confront them. Who owns these discoveries? For much of the modern era, the objects pulled from these sands were carried off to cataloged and displayed thousands of kilometers from where they were made by institutions belonging to nations that had no ancestral claim to them beyond the power to take them. The history of archaeology is inseparable from the history of empire. Many of the great collections in the world's famous museums exist because, at a particular moment, one country had the authority and the resources to excavate in another and to keep what it found. The people whose ancestors built those settlements were frequently not consulted, not credited, and not compensated. This is not a marginal footnote to the story of discovery. It is central to it, and it remains a live and contested issue today, with ongoing disputes over the repatriation of objects and the ethics of who gets to study and to hold the past. There is also the problem of destruction, which is more painful because it is often self-inflicted. Every excavation is, by its nature, a kind of controlled ruin. To dig down through the layers is to dismantle them. Once a layer is removed, it cannot be put back, and if it was not recorded carefully, the information it contained is gone permanently. Early excavators, driven by the desire for spectacular objects, frequently tore through the very evidence that would have told us how people actually lived, discarding the humble material in their haste to reach the impressive. We have lost more history to careless digging than we sometimes like to admit. Modern archaeology, with its obsessive documentation, is in large part a discipline built on regret, a reaction against the damage done by its own founders. And even now, when a site is exposed, the clock starts. What survived for 2,000 years under the sand can begin to degrade within days of being uncovered, as air and light and human contact undo what the desert protected. Then there is the darker pressure that shadows every significant find. The illegal trade in antiquities. The same qualities that make these objects precious to scholars make them valuable on a black market that stretches quietly across the world. Looters, sometimes desperately poor, sometimes highly organized, reach sites before or instead of archaeologists. And when they do, the destruction is total in a way that matters beyond the theft of individual pieces. A looted object arrives on the market stripped of its context. Nobody knows what layer it came from, what it was found beside, what the surrounding structure looked like. A statue in a private collection with no record of where it was dug from is, historically speaking, almost mute. It has been robbed not only of its physical location, but of its meaning. This is why archaeologists insist so fiercely on context, on the exact position and relationship of everything they find. An object without its context is a word without its sentence. So when we return to that image of something emerging from beneath the layers of sand, it deserves to be understood with more honesty and more depth than the phrase usually carries. What emerges is not a treasure in the simple sense. What emerges is a fragile, contested, painstakingly reconstructed window into lives that were never meant to be remembered. Every fragment carries with it a set of hard questions about how it was found, who found it, what was destroyed to reach it, and who has the right to keep it. The wonder is real, but it is a more sober wonder than the headlines suggest. It is the wonder of realizing how thin the thread is that connects us to the people who came before, and how much of what we know survives by pure accident rather than design. Perhaps that is the most valuable lesson these buried places offer. They remind us that history is not a solid, continuous record, but a scattering of fragments, most of them lost, a few of them preserved by chance, and an even smaller number recovered by people willing to do the slow and difficult work of understanding them. The settlements under the sand were not waiting to be found. They were simply lost, as most things are lost. What is remarkable is not that they disappeared, but that anything at all remained for us to read. And when we do read it, when we hold in our hands a child's writing exercise or a farmer's complaint about the weather, we are doing something the original writers could never have imagined. We are listening across an immense distance of time to people who assumed no one would ever listen. They wrote about their debts and their harvests and their small daily frustrations, never suspecting that the very ordinariness of their words would one day make them extraordinary. The desert did not preserve their story because their story mattered to the desert. It preserved it by accident, the way it preserves everything, without judgment and without purpose. What we make of it, the meaning we assign to these recovered voices, the care we take with them, and the honesty with which we ask how they came to us, that part is entirely up to us. And in the end, that responsibility may be the truest untold chapter of all. Not what lies beneath the sand, but what we choose to do once we have brought it back into the light.